Hey, grade school. What's up? Happy Friday morning to you guys. How is everyone? How are you on this fine day? I'm excited to be with y'all. It's going to be a good session. We've got two far-flung but very interesting topics to explore today, and lots to talk about, I'm sure. Get your questions ready. If you got questions, you got stuff you want to talk about, you got a bone to pick with me about the stuff I say on YouTube, you can drop that in here too. But be nice. Just be nice to me. You might not know this. I'm very sensitive. Gadali, did you know that about me? I'm a sensitive soul at heart.
I'm surprised.
With
Such a
this,
tough guy on the outside.
I know, with this hard, this leathered outer layer. I'm very delicate inside. I know, very surprising. My guy Gadali's here with me, as you guys can hear. It's going to be a really good session. Question for the group. Put a big old hand up if it's your first time being in grade school ever. I know my diehards are here. I love seeing you guys here every week. But if it's your first time being in grade school, give us a shout. Let us know. I'd love to hear from you. This is, if it is your first time, you might not know. This is like the highlight of my week. I love doing grade school on Friday mornings with you guys. There's an old saying that teaching is the chance to learn twice, and I really do feel that way. I learn so much from these sessions, and I get so energized and invigorated by the questions and the passion that everybody brings into it. So if it is your first time, let us know, and I'm super glad you're here. So today we are talking about the HDR zones palette and film grain, and I think we can cover all of those completely in the next 60 minutes. Maybe not. Maybe we can scratch the surface of one or both of those things. Let's get to it. You guys have any questions? Anything coming in yet there, Gadali?
Yeah. Question from Kushik. Which tonal range is the film grain most visible?
Good question. So let's dive right in and look at doing some film grain here in Resolve, and we can talk about the tonal range where we feel that the grain hitting most. You know, like if we're talking about which tonal range should it affect, like which tonal range would we expect it to affect if we're like in kind of a traditional film world, it depends on, it kind of goes back to that question of like, are we doing a positive or a negative film grain thing? But let's look at, I'm going to turn my gallery off and let's go to, oh, this is fine for now. I'm just going to zoom in here and, like you can think about this in terms of like, is it going to affect highlights or shadows more? And in fact, I think you've got, you have in our advanced controls here, you can actually control where that's sort of falling in most. So in shadows versus in midtones and in highlights. And to be honest with you, I haven't played with this setting a ton, so I don't know if it's like, I don't know what Resolve thinks of as shadows, midtones, and highlights. If it's just saying like shadows are like, 100% at 0 and tapering down to 0% at 1, and highlights are the opposite of that, and midtone is everything in between. That would be kind of like a lift gamma gain type of equation for deriving that. But I'm not exactly sure how it's deriving that math. And in terms of the way it actually goes like in a film system, let me see if I can get this right, because film is confusing, because negative with everything in a negative is upside down. So in the negative side of things, basically you are like, the more exposure you get, well, I feel like I'm going to screw up my answer here. You're going to see you're going to see in general, like when you're, let's just reason through it together. It's a good exercise. So in a negative, everything's upside down, right? So everything is starting as white essentially, and you are like subtracting from that as you are like exposing the image, and you're like accumulating dye in your different layers. So you are generally going to see the most noise in your highlights when you're on the negative side, because that's where like the absence of information is, if that makes sense. And then on the positive side, you're going to essentially see the opposite, where you're going to see more and more shadow, more and more grain rather, in your shadows, because you have to build up an exposure there. I think I'm getting that right. It's been a while since I reasoned through that in my head. And if someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's generally what I would expect to see there. And, like if you think about film emulation as a discipline, you guys know, like based on the pre-recorded video that I did this week and the way we talk about it in general, a lot of that stuff comes down to feel. In fact, I was just talking with a colorist this week for my podcast that's coming out super soon. A really, really great conversation this week that Gadali was there for, actually, so he can vouch for it. We had a fascinating conversation. In particular, we were talking about using film as a basis for good aesthetics, whether we're talking about texture or color or exposure or contrast or whatever. But really moving beyond that. And that's what I feel like the colorist I was talking to does an exceptional job of saying, like, yeah, like the images that this person grades are all very filmic, but they are not constrained to what a filmic system, to what a photochemical system would give you, if that makes sense. So that would be kind of my broader answer there, is to look at not only what a film system would give you, but what you would want to see out of that film system if you could get it. So in that sense, I think whatever ratio of shadows into, or rather grain into shadows, midtones, and highlights you wanted to do would, of course, be kind of fair play. My aesthetic would, kind of guide things to, I'd want to see an increase in those things as you climb the tone scale. So as you get into midtones and upward from there, I would want to see more, and I would want to see the shadows be a little bit cleaner, just in terms of my personal aesthetic. Good question. By the way, this episode is brought to you by Bubbly sparkling water. I'm drinking the mango today, and it's delicious. I'm kidding. What else we got?
All right. Question from Gucci. What's the difference between grain and noise?
Ooh, I'm really glad we get to address this question, because this has come up a lot. We've done videos in the last 6 months or so on noise reduction and on grain, and there have been some pretty contentious debates. One of the things that I love about this community here on this channel is everybody is so respectful, and even though we all care a lot, I really appreciate how everyone brings a professional tone to the exchange. There have been the closest that we've come to that edge of things getting a little unkind seems to have been when we're talking about grain and noise. So it's something people feel very, very strongly about. But here's the thing, from a human perspective, those are like, grain is a very distinct form of noise. From a systems analysis perspective and an information theory perspective, if you want to get fancy, grain is just a subcategory of noise. That's it. It's just a particular type of noise. It is a particular type of noise that you get with a photochemical system. So there is actually no quantifiable difference between the two. It's just noise in the system. And in the same way that, static on the radio, I don't have the same experience of static on the radio as I do grain in a movie, but those are actually both just noise in the system. So from a sort of objective technical POV, they're the exact same thing. In fact, one is just a subcategory of the other, to be a bit more specific. But then we have the sort of qualitative difference, or the aesthetic difference that we see between those two things. And those can be massive. Where that noise is distributed, like we were just talking about, is it more in your shadows, your midtones, or your highlights? And also, what is the temporal effect of that noise? How does it change over time? And what is the, the spatial effect of it? How does it feel on the individual image? Of course, that can all be very different. And, grain is a big thing. I was, looking recently at, there's a very high-end plugin. There's a couple of really high-end plugins, but one in particular that, some of the biggest post houses in the world pay to use on kind of a royalty basis for big projects, because it claims to be able to really, really nail the particular texture of the way that color and contrast and light interact with grain in a film system. So you can kind of keep going up that ladder and, getting as forensic as you like with the visual representation. But on the surface, the difference between grain and noise is really nothing. So I think it's helpful to remember that, actually, to say really all I'm looking for is a kind of noise that I like. That's it. There's nothing inherently beautiful or correct or incorrect about it. It's just a certain amount of noise that we like to see. It's kind of when I'm grading, if I'm building a creative look, let's go to the Voyager look set real fast here, the LUT pack that is. Let's look at a tone foundation here and look at Cygnus. So Cygnus, you can actually see in the histogram, is limiting black. You can even see it if we pull up a grayscale ramp, even better. and go to a waveform and bypass our color management, so we're only looking at what that LUT did. Look, the floor was here at 0, and now the blacks are dying above 0. That's throwing away dynamic range on paper, on a technical basis. I just happen to like what that sort of like imposition or that like destruction of the image does aesthetically, so I'm allowed to do it. No one can arrest me for it. Kind of the same thing with grain. You're actually imparting noise into the system, but if it does something you aesthetically like, then it's okay. So noise and grain are companions for sure.
Okay, a couple questions that I'll do at the same time. One, is film grain a viable option to mitigate color banding? And can noise help with clipping?
Yeah, those are two good questions. So yeah, can film grain be used as kind of a remedial solution? And I would say yes, in a couple different ways, and two of them just got listed there. Like I remember back in film school realizing that I could defeat like the banding that I would see in the compression of gradients, like if there was like a sunrise or something, or a gradient in an image, and then by the time you export and compress, the individual bands are kind of more present in there. One way that you could actually defeat that is to add random noise, grain being what I landed with in that case, so that banding was less apparent and the compressor was being forced not to dumb down those areas as much. So that can work. The other thing you can do, like that this kind of makes me think of, whether you're talking about banding or even like digital noise or like other artifacts that you need to clean up, you can totally do like kind of a trade where you end up applying. We did this actually, I think, in our noise reduction video, where you noise reduce and you go like kind of harder on the noise reduction than you could get away with if that was the only thing in your chain. Like let's just kind of mock this up real fast. If we do some noise reduction over here off to the right, and it doesn't happen to be a particularly noisy image, but we can use our imaginations and pretend that it is. Let's look at this one actually. Yeah, not particularly noisy, but we'll add some noise reduction here. And let's say we go so far that it's feeling pretty weird, like especially if I zoom in here and make this a little bit easier for you guys to see. Like that's getting a little bit odd, even more so if I bump up my radius. So like if we do like that level of noise reduction and then you apply grain on top of that, it can be used as a sort of way of like, all right, I did something that naked on its own doesn't work, but when you slap the grain back on top of it, you can get something interesting. So can grain be used as kind of a remedial thing like that, where you are adding it to mitigate banding or to hide the effects of a more aggressive noise reduction? Or a third one that I'll add into that category, if you have a visual effects element, or you have a shot that was like, let's say you shot a scene near sundown and you grabbed one shot right toward the end of the day, and it's like a lot further under in terms of exposure and you need to stretch it back up. You end up getting noise out of that image. You could, of course, noise reduce that image, or you could add a little bit of noise to the other shots in order to marry them together. That could be film grain, that could be some other kind of digital noise if you preferred, but that would be a third category of sort of corrective or remedial measures that you would use grain to implement. I think that can definitely work, and I think like the rule of thumb there is to do as little as possible, of course. So I think that can work, but even like, if we look at this example here, I'm probably going to annoy you for you looking at this over YouTube because it's not that easy to spot. Even though this grain is like now catching my eye more than like the kind of like dancing noise that's still present in the image underneath from this like kind of blocky noise reduction. See how this kind of feels weird here? With the grain on top of it, it feels better, but that's still down there, So sometimes the remedial measure is not like an absolute solve. So you would have to kind of weigh and look at this like, all right, is this working for me, or do I need to actually just go back to like where I was here? And is that the least distracting option? Or maybe it's the grain without noise reducing underneath that you can kind of like calibrate those different elements together. But yeah, you could use grain in those contexts for sure.
Question from Steven. In your video this week, your film grain node was placed before your look, but photochemically, isn't grain the last step when a positive print is generated? Is there a difference if the grain node follows the look nodes?
Great question. There is a difference, and here's the bugger of a print. There are no steps in a print. It just does a thing. In comes image, out comes different, out comes densities. That's it. So it's actually really, really difficult to say, oh, the grain happens here and the curve happens here and the color accumulation happens here. It's a closed system and those things are all happening simultaneously. So in terms of like, there's no explicit guidance we can necessarily get from the film tradition there. And, like in terms of whether you want to put film grain before or after, like, let's just kind of mock something up. I'm going to go back over to Voyager and I'm going to do something from the essentials. I'm going to use Canberra here just as a kind of vibey baseline. And let's just do my grain setup that we did this week. So I'm going to do a linear gamma node with a little bit of blur. Like so. And then we're going to do our grain right here. And let's just go with like, whatever, a 35 millimeter 400T and go pretty strong on the strength there. So like that's one version of things, right? Now, let me scrub through this and grab like a good telling still here. Maybe something like this. And look at what happens if we place it after the image. So I'm just tapping E to move these things out of the tree, out of the connection, and then I'm going to move them back over the other side. So you can see generally, like, you're having to, in terms of the grain, let's wipe here. Make that go full screen. This is kind of a torture test for YouTube, I know. So it's kind of tough to spot over YouTube. There is a difference. It doesn't happen to be super evident in this image, but the difference is going to be that in the version where we applied grain and blur before the curve, I don't have to do as much. Like, I'm having a greater impact with a lower result. Like the same adjustment here downstream, it's having slightly less of an impact on the image. You can see it like down below her bottom lip here. So that alone for me tells me that I want to work upstream of that curve because it means I don't have to hit things as hard. That's kind of the same reason why, like, here's a fun thought to like kind of cue off of what we're talking about. You guys have seen me talk about looks so much here on the channel, but I'm like, and I always put the look last. I'm like, well, who the hell is to say that it shouldn't go here? Like before I grade anything. Like, why can't I do that? There's a variety of reasons. One is that I'm going to be moving exposure up or down, and in doing so, like changing the reproduction and getting it less consistent. But for me, the biggest sort of like philosophical reason why I wouldn't do this is the same reason why I would prefer to put grain underneath, is because I want to be operating on the image in closer to its scene linear or to its scene state than I want to be closer to that than what I get after I've applied my look. So like textural things and, like any other grading decisions, those are generally going to feel better done underneath the overall look than they are underneath, than they are after the fact. So that's how I would think about that. There's no explicit answer in terms of the way film works. And in general, you're going to be able to do less and get more as a result of putting this underneath the curve. And you're going to tend to, you're basically working on a more like, on a less modified version of the image, which for grain is, I think, a bit more of a gray area than like exposure. But I do think it's still beneficial to be applying that texture to the image at more of its original state than further downstream when it's received more alteration.
Okay, question from Dennis. Do you know how to fix the discrepancy between using Resolve Color Management with DaVinci Wide Gamut and Rec 709 output versus building a color space transform in YRGB, the output looks completely different. And to summarize, because we've gotten this question before, my node-based color management and my project-based color management look different. Why? What are the settings that might make that happen?
Okay, let's talk about that. Because maybe I'm just not a very observant colorist, but I have not seen that before. So what I'm going to do for a moment here, let's go to just like a test image here of Isabella. I'm going to reset everything. And I'm just checking all the different sections of my node graph to make sure there's nothing happening in my node graph. And we're just going to double check our color management settings real quick here. Make sure that I've got my input color space, first of all, set to log C3, which I do. Go to our color management, and we've got everything set up properly. Input color space, timeline color space, 709 gamma 24, output DRT luminance mapping, input DRT none. Make sure you're at custom 10,000 for this. And then I don't even need to hit save because nothing's going to change. And let's grab a still. Now we can right click on this and hit bypass color management. And we're going to recreate this same pipeline in nodes. So we're going to go like so. We're going to say ARRI wide gamut 3, ARRI log C3, DaVinci wide gamut, DaVinci intermediate, no tone mapping, no gamut mapping, no OOTF. And then over here, we're going to go DaVinci wide gamut, DaVinci intermediate, Rec 709, gamma 24, luminance mapping. And then here's how I like to do these. 10,000 to 100, gamut mapping to saturation compression, forward OOTF. And if I wipe between those, let me just make sure I've got a full screen wipe here. My gamut is shifting a little bit in the, it looks like if I had to guess in my project level color management, this is not being turned on. Yeah. So if I leave that off, I'm dead on. One to the other, so you should be able to get there. Would be the idea there. Hopefully that little recap maybe helps you to go in and kick the tires on your settings, but you definitely should be able to get there because Resolve Color Management is just color space transforms being applied under the hood behind the scenes. Hope that helps.
All right. Let's see. Would you say in general, it's better to use the HDR wheels on the clip level versus in the timeline? If using the HDR wheels, do you prefer turning the wheels freely or typing in discrete numbers?
Oh, yeah, good questions about the HDR wheels. So I would say in terms of the first question, yes. I in the past, you know, like I've had a whole journey with the HDR wheels, and there are parts of them that, you know, like especially for me when I first started working with them, like the curves situation here and the fact that like I can move my values and see changes in this net curve here, that sort of led me to feel like, oh, maybe this is like a pretty interesting look dev tool. But I would say I would not use the HDR zones palette for look dev at all at this point in my practice. You know, we talked about look dev a couple weeks back, and I intentionally didn't include the HDR zones palette just because remember with look dev, the big challenge is like, we've got to make a thing that looks great on every single, we've got to make a thing that looks great on like whatever number of shots we test out, 50, 60, 100, but it also has to look great on shots that we haven't tested out. And by the time we've cooked it and are using it, if it's not working on those shots, we got a problem, right? So the HDR zones palette, just by its nature of being a little bit more granular and, you know, like sort of scalpel-esque, would not be my first choice for look dev. So I would not do it at any kind of timeline or group level. I would use it as a seasoning on individual shots as necessary. And then in terms of the second part of the question, like, do you key in remote values or use it, you know, more kind of freehand? I would say for like pretty much everything that I do, other than like drawing curves, because there's no real interface on the control surface for that in Resolve, other than drawing custom curves, pretty much everything I do from the control surface. So I would, you know, like work my exposure here or my saturation in my darks is what I'm working on right now. Or, you know, like on the global side, this is actually, you know, like the one thing I don't think we talked about in the HDR zones palette, hands down, the most useful, well, I'll put it to you guys before I answer. What's the most useful, best wheel, best knob inside of the HDR Zones palette? Think about it to yourself. I don't know if the YouTube lag will permit me to stand here silently while I wait for the stream to catch up. But think about it for yourself. Answer it for yourself. What is the best knob, the best tool inside of the HDR Zones palette? At least, what would Cullen's answer be? And then you can tell me if you think I'm crazy. All right. Did you get it? It's the global wheel. The global wheel is really good. We've talked about sort of like upgrading your toolkit a couple times recently here on the channel, but a great upgrade to your toolkit in terms of like, let's say that you love my default node tree and you're just looking at swapping out the tools that you use for each of these nodes. A great upgrade to your node tree would actually be to move off of using offset to using the HDR global wheel. The HDR global wheel is actually better. It's more photometric, it's more accurate, it's going to do a better job of keeping your shadows in place, especially as you go with positive exposure. It's a better tool. And we've had the question come up recently about like, well, then why don't you teach it? Why don't you recommend it, Cullen? My thinking there is that getting one fairly minor gain in one tool is not worth the complexity of adding a whole other tool set when you're first learning Resolve. But if you want to upgrade your workflow, switching over to now two things that we've talked recently about, either switching your exposure node to linear gamma and using gain in your primaries, or using your HDR global exposure. Those are both very, very similar to each other and are both an improvement over working with offset, in my opinion. So that's the one that I use most, certainly one that I use from the control surface. And I'll use the other ones from the control surface as well. So just work the exposure or work the color balance of the individual zones, more in that realm as opposed to keying in discrete values.
All right. Let's see. Question from Sasha. What are your thoughts on combining the highlight slider in primaries and the HDR wheel highlights or light? I found decreasing the highlight with the slider, then pushing the HDR wheel provides different results.
Interesting. You know, that's something that I have not tried. Let's go to a shot where we've got some stronger highlights in play, maybe over here. We can look at kind of how we're going to end up affecting those sources in the frame. So pulling highlights and then pushing them in the HDR side. I'll put it this way, like if you can get a good result out of that, that works great. But it kind of goes back to our premise that we talked about again this week of like simplicity beats complexity. That better be necessary, right? Because if it's not, then you're doing something too complicated, and that means you are going to not be able to do it as often or as consistently or as effectively because it takes you longer to do the highlights and then tap over to your HDR zones and find that balance there. But if they give you like a nice blend, I do think like something that I've come to appreciate more and more in my color grading practice in the last few years. Yeah, I mean, I think I can see what you mean there. Here's your before and your after. Maybe that's interesting. But what I was going to say is something I've come to appreciate more and more in the last couple of years in my color grading practice is finding knobs that really interact well is a craft in and of itself. I've always been, we've talked about this even on grade school before, I've kind of always been like a one knob kind of guy. Like, no, what's the knob? Where is the knob? How do I find the knob? We even discussed that in the HDR Zones video this week. But the reality is a lot of the time you don't want a knob. What you want is two knobs that you can play against each other and get that broad overlap, get that crosstalk, get that interaction. So that's something that I've really come to appreciate in my practice is like finding pairs of knobs that really interact in an interesting way and give me results that I couldn't get with one single knob. So maybe you found one that is in that category for you when you're talking about playing primaries highlights against HDR zones highlights, and you're able to get really interesting results that you can't get otherwise. So I certainly wouldn't discourage that at all. And in fact, I would encourage looking for pairs like that that you feel like do something that you couldn't otherwise get. But that's the only caveat. Make sure it's doing something that you couldn't otherwise get. Because if there is one knob for it, that is, of course, the preferable route to take.
Question from Faizan. Can you shed some light on some custom color processing in DaVinci YRGB color managed, explaining timeline working luminance, limiting output gamut, and input and output DRT. What are those settings? How are they different than just straight up using the default DaVinci intermediate setting?
Yeah, let's talk through those things. So I'm going to go to this image here, and I'll just kind of like give you the overview before we look at it on images here. So let's say we go to, you know, like stock DaVinci intermediate here, which would be, I don't even actually know. I guess that would be HDR DaVinci wide gamut intermediate. That HDR tag is so confusing. Like HDR, except I'm mastering SDR. Okay. So this is basically, you know, like that we're doing a riff on this when we go to custom, and I'm hoping that when I go back to custom now that I'm going to see my variables reset to what is happening under the hood with this mode, which I am. Yeah. So that's a good trick to know. If you want to know what these settings are for the HDR DaVinci wide gamut intermediate preset, all you have to do is click on this and then go back to custom, and you will see what the settings driving that preset are, which is useful to see. So input color space, obviously that's going to change appropriately to accommodate whatever your camera or cameras are. Timeline color space, that's going to be the same. Let's talk about timeline working luminance. Timeline working luminance, this is a sort of viral idea that has found its way into the color grading world that I think is probably a result of like, so think about it this way. If you are around my age or much older, you learned to color grade almost certainly. If you put it this way, if you're around my age or any older and you did not work in film laboratories where you were exposed to color timing techniques, you almost certainly learned your craft by working display referred. And just as a recap, we all know display referred means that you are grading by referring to your display. You're not color managing, you're not working under a LUT, you're just looking at the image and using your hands to make it look correct on that display. And if the source image has a color space that's different from the display, you're not really thinking about that or aware of that. You're just grading to kind of brute force things into place, right? So if you're my age or older, that's how you learned to color grade. So as a result, that's a huge portion of professional DaVinci Resolve users, right? There's any number who don't fit that description, but that's a large body of professional colorists. So I think like this HDR working luminance thing, a lot of the concessions that we see in these color management settings are to make color management feel a little bit less foreign and a little bit more familiar to those of us who learned in that way, who maybe are having trouble saying bye-bye to that way of working. But to go back to the matter at hand, timeline working luminance, this is essentially limiting your dynamic range while you are grading. So this is literally what you can like look at here is this and this are being used to form your input CST. So let's just focus in on that for a minute. So what I'm effectively doing here is limiting my luminance from my incoming space with area log C3. That's going to be around, area log C3 actually doesn't have that much more dynamic range than this. It only has about 5,500 nits, but that changes depending on your camera. You'll have a lot more than that depending on the camera that's coming in. So you are saying, even in the case of that fairly low 5,500 nits, you're limiting that off. You're either rolling or chopping that off at 4,000 nits. My question has always been, why? What benefit does that net? Because we're going to be doing more tone mapping later. That's what we're going to do when we talk about our output DRT. Sooner or later, if we're talking about SDR, we got to get down to 100 nits. And if we're talking about HDR, we got to get down to 1,000 nits. So it's not like it's not even like, oh, you're applying your tone mapping too early. You're applying your tone mapping redundantly and too early, if that makes sense. So that's why I set my timeline working luminance to custom 10,000, because all that does is say, just take the negative and move it into my sandbox where I can play with it, but don't limit its dynamic range yet. Like, you can limit the dynamic range of my graded master when you have to so that the image reproduces correctly. But until then, why would we limit our dynamic range? Why would we chop off the top of that image. It may not be noticeable, it may not present a problem in one image or in one project, but why would we take that chance? Why bother? Just let it flow through until we actually need it to be lower in dynamic range, which is not until we're going to our display. That's why I set the custom to 10,000. And I'm going to skip ahead now. We'll come back to our output gamut in a minute, but this working luminance interacts with this and with this. So these are basically, like let's say that we did set that timeline working luminance to 4,000 and we've got an input of Arilog C3, which has 5,500 nits. Okay, so we've got a question mark now there. What should I do with those extra 1,500 nits that are coming from the camera negative? There's a couple things that I can do. If I set my input DRT to simple, I'm just going to get a foot shorter. If I'm coming in 5,500 nits tall, I will be 4,000 nits tall by removal of my head, if that makes sense, with the simple input DRT. And then DaVinci, luminance mapping, and saturation preserving are all simply different schemes for, to use my favorite expression, fitting 10 pounds of dirt into a 5-pound sack. We've got 5,500 nits. Somehow, some way, those 5,500 nits need to become 4,000, and these other three schemes are slightly more slightly more nuanced strategies for fitting those 5,500 nits than to simply chop off my head. It's going to compress things using some kind of tone curve. Okay, so that's the idea there. And again, my question would be like, well, if I've now got my ceiling at 10,000 nits, which you're not really going to find an incoming camera source with more dynamic range than that, I don't need this at all, do I? And like, really, these are the same thing. Like, why would I tone map when before I've even done any grading? Tone mapping is for after I've got a graded master and I need it to actually make sense on a display. So that's why I turned that off. Output DRT, you guys have heard me talk about this before. It's the same options that we have here with the addition of red IPP2. These are just different schemes for fitting larger dynamic range into smaller dynamic range. My preference inside of Resolve Color Management, generally speaking, is luminance mapping. You're free to play around with any one of these, and any one of them that consistently gets you a good looking image is fair play, in my opinion. I'm going to leave that at luminance mapping. And then if we say limit output gamut to output color space, this is a setting that you don't really need to change ever, unless you are doing a deliverable for a streaming platform, in which case, for reasons that are kind of crazy, there's like this very in vogue deliverable that like most streaming platforms are going to demand these days, where they want like this, and this is for HDR specifically, where they are going to want Rec 2020 PQ at some nit level. So often 1,000 nits. They're going to want Rec 2020 as the deliverable. That's a problem for us as colorists because I don't have a Rec 2020 monitor, right? So that's where, in this case, I would want to say limit my output gamut to P3D65. Now, the question arises here, well, why wouldn't I just do P3D65 ST2084 1000 nit? To which I would answer, I don't know. If that's a deliverable, that like if they wanted another metric, that's fine. But that's really the only time you would need to change that limit output gamut is if you're doing that exact workflow where you're having to deliver that in vogue Rec 2020 deliverable for a streaming platform, because they are also going to want you to limit the output gamut to P3 so that all the colors in that outputted master can actually be shown. Other than that, in any other application, make sure that your output gamut matches, make sure that your limit output gamut is set thusly, and then just set your output color space to whatever color space your monitor works in, and then you're home. So I hope that's like some interesting overview stuff. And then if I just hit save here, we should see basically no change. And you can look at like, just with this output DRT setting, check out like red IPP2. And then you actually get more options based on, like red's scheme. If we look at the image here, that's going to change, right? And that's because these are different schemes for performing that math problem of fitting your higher dynamic range into your lower dynamic range. So every one of these settings is going to give you a different reproduction, and finding out which one works best for you in all broad different kinds of circumstances, that just takes some trial and error. And you might find that you actually like mixing things up. I've found that when I'm using luminance mapping, and then I can use a nice high quality body of LUTs, of creative LUTs like my Voyager LUT pack, I can kind of get wherever I need to go on any particular project by keeping things consistent in that way. So I hope that's kind of a helpful overview of like the color management setup here inside of Resolve.
Question from Nick. Have you ever noticed choosing between DaVinci and Luminance mapping sometimes shows a difference between the red and yellow hues on the ODT? If so, do you know why?
Yes, I have. And it is because this is kind of fun. We're getting sort of techie and color sciencey today. I love it. The reason why that happens is there's like a dirty truth that is resting at the bottom of like all color grading, basically. And that's this. Let me get my situation set back up here. I'm just going to do a custom curves thing to make a demonstration of something. If I go in and I manipulate my custom curves, and I have all my channels ganged together, the intuition would be that if I do this, and I make like an S-curve or whatever, I just have an arbitrary midpoint that doesn't currently reflect mid-gray. And actually, yeah, I want to demo something for all of us in just a moment. But let's just, like if I have this curve, and I'm just going to pick a mid-gray kind of arbitrarily, and I do a curve like this, what do I think I'm altering when I do this? Contrast, right? I'm not modifying individual channels. Everything's ganged together. What I would expect is that I'm altering contrast. But take a look at the vector scope. The colors, the saturations are changing. The crazy thing is the hue changes as well. So this is like the top level like observation that we can make from that. Simply by altering red, green, and blue in the same way across all three channels, we are going to impact saturation and we are going to impact hue. So that means when we tone map, because that's what we're doing when we tone map, is affecting all three channels at once. When we tone map, depending on how we tone map, we are going to see changes in hue. And when we look at different tone mapping schemes, such as DaVinci versus saturation preserving versus luminance mapping, those schemes, one of their key considerations is how am I impacting the hues and the saturations of the image as I attempt to influence the color or the dynamic, or excuse me, the luminance or the dynamic range, the contrast of the image. That's one of the main differences between those systems, is they kind of have different intent or philosophy or math driving the way that tone mapping is done, aimed at keeping hues the same or letting hues rotate or do whatever you want. But it's a crazy thing that like only clicked for me not that long ago in my color grading practice, that like just making simple contrast adjustments changes saturation and it even changes hue. So that's the difference that you're seeing between those two systems. And before we move on, I want to take a quick time out and just share something that I feel like has been coming up a lot here on the channel. I don't know if anyone here in grade school is struggling with it, but I did just want to demonstrate it. I've been using my DaVinci wide gamut gray power grade quite a bit lately. This is interesting. There we go. And I'm just dropping this on here, and then I think a lot of folks have been downloading the starter kit and not finding this power grade. I actually haven't included this power grade in the starter kit. What you need to do in order to get this is the following. Go to your effects, find DCTL, drop it onto a node, and then you're going to scroll through this list and look for CKC exposure chart. Set your total steps to 1, set your tone curve to DaVinci intermediate, turn off show ramp, and now you've got it. And if you like that, you can label it, call it DaVinci wide gamut gray, and grab it as a still and save it into your power grades. So I don't know if anyone here in the room has been struggling with that, but I just wanted to like emphasize that because I feel like it's been coming up a lot in comments. But yeah, to go back to our question, that's the fundamental difference between those schemes, is when you're altering RGB, even when you're doing the same thing to all three channels, you're going to end up altering hue and saturation, which is like fascinating and a little like disorienting and overwhelming to me, but it is the reality of working with RGB and directly manipulating it to tone map your image.
All right. Chucka is asking, can you do a quick run through on how to use the Voyager LUTs using ACEs?
Oh, okay, sure. So we want to look at using the Voyager LUTs with ACEs. So here's the caveat with ACEs, or excuse me, with using the Voyager LUTs with ACEs. The Voyager LUTs, any LUTs that you look at, any LUTs worth using, any creative LUTs, are designed in a particular context. So when I was designing the Voyager LUT, if I had been designing them under this image, this would have been my foundation under which I would build the curve of, whatever, like the way that I knew that I liked that Cygnus was ready to ship on this image is I would load it onto this image and I would like what I was seeing as a result of not only the LUT, but my color management. Right? So that's the context that I used to create these LUTs in. So if we change that context, then you're not going to see what I, the designer, saw when I said, thumbs up, ship it, it's perfect. That's not a deal breaker. That's not like a terrible thing, but it is something worth knowing and being aware of, like, all right, I'm doing something slightly different than the designer had in mind. So here's how I would actually use those LUTs in a practical sense. So I'm actually trying to think, Joko, what the best thing would be. Gadali, read me off his question again.
You promised to give a quick run through to how to use Voyager LUTs with ACEs. Any chance to do it today at the end of grade school? That was it.
Okay, got it. Yeah. So there's different ways that we could skin this, but it sounds like you actually want to grade fully in ACEs and just use the Voyager LUTs within there. So here's how I would do that. Let's bypass our color management on this shot. And I'm just going to do this. I could do it. Well, let's do it in our project settings, actually. I'm going to go to my color science, and I'm going to go to ACES CCT. ACES can be 1.3. Input can be area log C3. Sure, we can apply our reference gamut compression. Output transform can be Rec 709. So just a stock ACES setup here at the project level of my image. And let me just make sure I've got everything turned off. And so now I'm looking at ACES instead of Resolve Color Management. And let me just make sure I've got that all properly set up. Yeah. So here's what I would do. Let's say I want to start breaking out some of the Voyager LUTs. Essentially, all I've got to do is right-click on a node and change my gamma and my color space. So I'm going to change gamma to DaVinci Intermediate, color space to DaVinci Wide Gamut, and then I could drop a LUT on here. Now again, Cygnus inside of ACES looks different than Cygnus inside of Resolve Color Management, and in general, ACES is going to be a little bit higher in contrast, so a reasonable thing to do might be to just like pull back on your key output gain a little bit, like so that your net contrast is a bit more aligned. On the palette side, you might not have to go as crazy with that, but on the tone side, I think that's generally a good idea. And then you would literally just do that same setup for any of your other LUTs. So I just copied and pasted that so I don't have to go in and re-tag those attributes. And then on this LUT where I'm using the split toning, the tone modifier, I'm just doing full strength, but again, I'm in DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. And then same thing with my palette. Let's just copy and paste this. For the palette, I'm going to use Mars. And for the modifier, I'll use Hyperion, my favorite. So that's the shorthand of how I would do it in ACES. Just work in ACES and then set your gamma and your... oh wait, it looks like that didn't take. That's interesting. I'm just going to make sure that the color space and the gamma need to be set appropriately. And what you'll find as well in the palette options is you might not even need to move their color space or their gamma. Like if we just, let me label these so we're not getting lost. So here's our tone foundation. Here's our tone modifier. Here's our palette foundation. And here's our palette modifier. And what you'll find is like, okay, in my tone foundation, if I go in here and I set this gamma back to use timeline, actually that's interesting. I should be seeing a significant change there. Okay, let's test something out here. We should be like, what I'm driving at here is one of my favorite subjects, mid-gray preservation. That's like the first thing I want to kind of ensure. So let's turn off my color management, because I should be, if I change from, oh, interesting. This tag seems to be confused about what color space we are in. So those tags, interesting. I guess I haven't done this in ACES before. So let's modify our workflow a little bit. To catch you up on what I'm seeing here, normally when we use these tags, the reason we can use these tags so quickly in Resolve is because it knows what color space we are in. In this case, we are in ACES CCT, meaning AP1 primaries with an ACES CCT tone curve. In this case, so when I'm, as a result of that, if I set my color space back to use timeline, and I set my gamma to use timeline, if I flip between use timeline and ACES CCT, I should see no change because timeline is ACES CCT, right? So the fact that I'm seeing a change there tells me Resolve is not passing the right information to these nodes, which means that I can't use that handy dandy shortcut. So what I want to do instead is this. We're just going to do a color space transform section of our node graph. And we're going to go from AP1, ACES CCT, to DaVinci wide gamut, DaVinci intermediate. No tone mapping, no gamut mapping, no OOTF, but white point turned on because those things are different. It's about a D60 versus a D65. And I'm just going to label this and say to DaVinci wide gamut. And then on this side, we're going to say to CCT. And I'm just going to flip these. And in doing so, we are creating my favorite colorist delicacy. Some of you guys might already know about it, the sandwich. We've made a sandwich that, until I start applying those looks, let's just turn this ramp off for now as well. So just this sandwich, this round trip, going from ACES into DaVinci wide gamut, and then going from DaVinci wide gamut back into ACES, the net of that, let me turn my color management back on for a minute. The net of that should be nothing, right? Nothing's happening whatsoever. But what is happening is I'm applying my LUTs in the proper metric. And now we can finally demo what I wanted to show a moment ago. If I turn my tone foundation on, this tone foundation applied, let's go full strength with it for a minute so it's really easy to see. Applying this tone foundation with this sandwich on either side of it will give me different results than if I don't have that sandwich on either side of it. See what I mean there? No sandwich, so I'm effectively misapplying a DaVinci wide gamut LUT inside of ACES with sandwich, so I'm now appropriately applying a DaVinci wide gamut LUT inside of DaVinci wide gamut. It just happens to be in kind of like a trough of an ACES working space. So that's how I would actually tackle that. I'm really glad we got to go over it together because that gamma and color space tagging mechanism that I would typically use does not seem to be working, at least in, what am I in, 18.1.2? Yeah, of Resolve here. So maybe that used to work and now doesn't, or maybe it's something that hasn't been implemented within the ACES color science framework. But that's how I would go about that, is move into DaVinci wide gamut, do whatever you want to do, and then move back out. Now, you might find that you're going to end up with like some clipping or some gamut problems because AP1 is quite a bit smaller than DaVinci wide gamut intermediate. But if you are, well, you could, there are different ways that you could address this, but maybe the easiest one would be to do an ACES transform after you transform back and set your input transform to ACES CCT and your output transform to ACES CCT, and then do the ACES reference gamut compression. That's not going to do anything to this image. You can see there's like some really small traces up in my warm colors that are being bounded in by this, but that's basically just going to ensure that you're not getting negative or values above 1 once you round trip back into ACES. Hope that helps. We got time for one or two more here.
Okay. Question from Jim Robinson. How is the pivot point on the contrast not changing the middle gray point in the contrast in your dev look? Seems to me that it is overlapping.
Read that to me one more time.
I mean, basically, does changing the pivot point when you do a contrast adjustment affect your mid-gray point set in your look?
Got it. Got it. Yeah. I mean, actually, this is a great one to cover because I've been wanting to touch on this for a while. It's a really good question, and one that's come up a lot because I beat the drum here on the channel so loudly for preserve middle gray, no middle gray, preserve middle gray. And I am a huge fan of that at the look level. At the shot level, I am reckless with mid-gray. I am abusive with mid-gray. I do not care what mid-gray is. I don't even know what mid-gray is by the time I'm done grading up a shot with a client. I'm just putting the image wherever we want to see it go. So in terms of look dev, yes, absolutely. Like, let's say we want to do something that I've talked about here on the channel before. Let's say we love my 2383 and we just want to like do a little bit of negative contrast upstream so it's not quite as aggressive. If I go to my contrast pivot and I just start opening my contrast, Jim is absolutely right. Right now with my pivot at 0.435, that means that I'm going to be moving middle gray in my system because the pivot point of DaVinci wide gamut is not 0.435. So what I want to do is set that to 0.336 if I want to have a truly neutral contrast or a mid-gray preserving contrast point in my look. So that's a very good observation and an important thing. When you're doing any kind of contrast pivot at a system or a look level, you should be setting your pivot to align with the mid-gray of your system. My mid-gray cheat sheet will give you those values if you don't happen to have a head full of mid-gray points for various color spaces. So that can be very helpful. But the counterpart to that is like when I'm actually grading in my node tree, like with any of these images, I have, you know, in my actual, let me just go in here. I'll show you guys my advanced node tree here, which has a custom contrast tool. By the way, Colorist Career Accelerator is coming up this coming weekend. I'm so excited about it. It's going to be an awesome 4 days, and I'm so excited for everyone who was able to grab a seat before we sold out, before we even opened up for general registration. So I'm really excited to see you guys in there. And those who are in there are going to receive some of the tools that I'm about to show off, some of these custom DCTLs. But in my actual grading setup, one of the things that I will use is this contrast DCTL. And in the setup where I am working, depending on what I'm doing, like this one is actually set up to pivot around the mid-gray of log C3, which is a space that I grade in a lot. But I will set this pivot point to the pivot point of my working space. And then that will be my foundational point, and I will work contrast within that. And then if I want to move my pivot, I'm certainly not shy about it. I will do it like and move it wherever makes the image look good. But I do start it at that default mid-gray position for my working color space, but I'll move it around in the case of grading at the shot level. Grading at the timeline of the look level, yes, absolutely. Set that pivot to align with the mid-gray of your system if you want to preserve your mid-gray, which you should. All right, we got time for one more quick one.
Okay. Hopefully a quick color science one then. Zach is wondering, he said he saw a technique for subtractive color using SAT-only HSL node with a gain at 0.5, followed by a SAT-only HSV node with gamma set to 1.99. What's happening there? Why does that, why is that supposed to work, or what is it doing?
Right, yeah, so that's a variation on a technique that has been out there for a while in different forms, where we are essentially, just to visualize it, we're using HSL and only the SAT channel, which would be channel 2 of HSL, and you would do some kind of trim of saturation in that model. And then, so basically you're losing color here, and then you're gonna add that same amount of color back in HSV, with the idea that, like, you are going to net with no change in saturation, but your color is going to feel more subtractive when you do it in the second system. Now, the spin of doing it with gain in HSL versus gamma in HSV, I haven't heard that before. That's perfectly workable. But from a technical POV, the best place to start would be, let's set, okay, so that's channel 2. Color space tag is HSV here. Color space tag is HSL here. So yeah, these are not identical color models. So like applying 50% gain in one system and then 200% gain in the other is not necessarily going to get you, that's pretty close actually. So short answer, why does that work? That works because when you are like talking about saturation, this is like a color science theme that has gotten really clear to me in the last couple of years. Our whole system is based on RGB. Cameras capture RGB, we flow RGB, we grade RGB, we reproduce on a screen that has red, green, and blue emitters. That's absolute. That I can tell you how much red information did that camera record, or how much green information, how much green energy is coming off of that display. Those are absolute things that I can measure and I can tell you definitively. What is the saturation of that image? That I actually cannot tell you definitively because there's no saturation channel that was captured. Saturation is a factor that is derived from the RGB. And it turns out there's a bunch of different ways to compute saturation, none of which are explicitly wrong or right. They're just different. And remember, saturation is also a matter of perception. So it's like, does your model for computing saturation include human perception, or is it just a way of saying, you know, how far out from the 0 point on the vector scope does your plot, does your RGB point plot? There's all kinds of different ways to devise saturation. Two of them are the HSL method and the HSV method. The HSV method happens to define saturation by first extracting the greatest value from red, green, and blue. That's called a max RGB. So when you take that away, you're going to be left with, you can't ever get greater than that original value was, which is a good sort of working definition for subtractive color. HSL works in a different way. It defines its luminance and removes that or puts it in its own channel in a different way, hence the L versus the V designation. So that's really what's going on. It's two different methods of saturation that are doing a similar thing. Like when I pull out color here, like, yep, there was color and now there's less color. You can see it in the vector scope. And when I add color here, you're like, yep, there was color and now there's more color. So they're doing a roughly similar thing visually, but the math for computing like S in HSL and S in HSV, the math is being computed completely differently. And the S value of, say, this red teapot here, the S value in HSL is not at all the same as the S value in HSV. So you're manipulating a different channel and in doing so getting a different visual result. So I hope that's a helpful idea. But yeah, you can definitely, like, there's a lot of variation on that you can do where you say, all right, I'm going to pull out some more generic saturation and then I'm going to reintroduce it, but using some kind of HSV saturation, and in doing so get no net change in saturation, but denser colors as a result. So that's definitely a fun thing to play around with inside of Resolve. You guys are awesome. I hope you have an awesome Friday. I hope you have an awesome weekend. Great spending grade school Friday morning with you guys, as always. Thanks to Gadali for being my co-host. Everyone have an awesome Friday, an awesome weekend. I'll see you next week. And for my Colorist Career Accelerator folks, I will see you in class next week, which means we will not be doing grade school next week because we're going to be in the midst of CCA. So we will have videos coming out, but no grade school. And we will resume that the following week. So in the meanwhile, everyone be well, take care of yourselves, and happy grading. Have a great weekend.